disruptive for the technicians, but yes, please, sound in this. I was supposed to go there. So good morning or good day, everyone, and welcome to Collective Moods in Precarious Times. And I thought that I would start with a little test, a little mood test before we get started for this keynote conversation. First of all, I'd like to know how many people in the room have attended previous events of the festival. Could you please raise your hands? Okay, good, thanks. So we have a really good mix here of different moods in the room. I'm supposing that there is kind of a bias then, I don't know in which direction, in relation to how much you attended or not. And I would like to, ask you if you're actually feeling bored. And I would like to measure this state of boredom or attention moods in the audience by suggesting that you could raise your hand if you feel bored. So let's say that low is high level of attention or boredom, whatever you like. Actually, no. The boredom is the higher you go. So low is high, high is low. Okay? And now I move to make the introduction. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this, the third and final keynote event of Transmediale 2019, Collective Moods in Precarious Times with Ben Anderson and Rebecca Coleman, and there will be an introduction and moderation by Devika Sharma. And this keynote conversation touches upon some of the core concerns of this year's Transmediale, for which we were inspired by Raymond Williams' influential notion of structures of feeling as a concept dealing with lived experience and how this is translated, or let's say effectively expressed through cultural forms and sentiments. And we have also been interested in asking what these structures of feeling of our contemporary moment could be. And this is a contemporary moment that I think seems to be characterized, by emotionalized politics, as well as the incorporation of feelings in technology. So where does manipulation take place? When does control stop? When does agency begin? What moves you? So these are questions that refer not only to, let's say, well, they do refer to an emotion on an individual and on a collective scale, but they also refer to the infrastructures, even, be they then social or cultural or technological, that govern how moods, feelings, in a broader sense, also affect, takes place, and bodies and subjects become mobilized. And we feel at Transmediale that there is an urgency to move beyond both polarizing kind of for and against public collective moods, which are dominant today, as well as a kind of neoliberal complacency, like an everything's fine mentality. And we're going to hear from two speakers that have something interesting to say on these topics. And there will be more from Devika Sharma also as our moderator here. And I will introduce Devika. So she also has made significant contributions to working through the problems of contemporary structures of feeling. She's an associate professor of modern culture at the University of Copenhagen. She's the author in Danish of American Prison Imagery, Arts, Culture, and Incarceration in the Contemporary US. She's co-editor of Structures of Feeling, Affectivity and the Study of Culture. She works currently on topics dealing with affectivity, culture critique, and the politics of guilt and shame in Scandinavia. And in this context, she's writing now a monograph on humanitarian culture and complicity with the working title, The Predicament of Privilege. Please welcome Devika and the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christopher, for this very kind introduction and for inviting me to take part in this conversation on collective moods. Please don't do that hand thing while I'm talking. I mean, I think it will be disturbing if everyone raises their hand too high, but So when thinking about forms of emotional collectivity, Raymond Williams' concept of structures of feeling is a fruitful place to begin, as suggested by our two keynote speakers this afternoon, the transmediale team, and several of the events here at the festival already. With this notion, which takes on different meanings at different times in Williams' work, he sought to capture an elusive stratum of reality, fleeting in its manifestations, but nonetheless important in the making of historical facts. In his 1977 collection of essays, Marxism and Literature, Williams described the peculiar something he wanted to identify as a particular quality of social experience and relationship, historically distinct from other particular qualities, which gives the sense of a generation or a period. So experience is really the key term here, as is the collectivity that Williams associated with a generation or a period. So what seems to interest Williams is the basic but highly complex phenomenon of lived presence. What does it feel like to be in a particular period of time, he asked. How do our inclinations for doing this and not that emerge, and how does that change? What Williams invites us to recognize then is a participant's perspective on culture. So in a sense, Williams suggested complementing the analysis of social and material infrastructures of reality with a third layer, that of affective infrastructures. And that concept has been with us already in the form of the study circle and the panel on creating commons, and we will learn more about that concept today. So Williams' work prefigured the contemporary interest in affective collectivity. We find another noteworthy prefiguration of this contemporary interest in the 1960s and 70s feminism and women's movement, of course, and the battle cry, "The personal is political." One way to understand this rallying cry is as a framework for thinking the entanglement of affect and politics, emotion, politics, economics, and other decidedly material conditions of life. Just think of Silvia Federici's and Wages Against Housework, 1975 pamphlet on affective labor, which begins like this: we say it's love, they say it's love, we say it's unwaged work. So while this endeavor was never the preserve of feminist thinking, it is still worth stressing the intervention of 1970s feminism in a modern genealogy of the notion of affect as a collective phenomenon. Also, 1970s feminists had an eye for the ideological functions of the gender distinctions between reason and emotion. They recognized that the differential distribution of power and opportunities that they experienced was legitimated not least by the equally differential distribution of reason and emotionalism. So, and when attending to this early feminist work on affect, we also realized that social precarity and inequality have for long been implied in the exploration of collective cultures of feeling. Thinkers and activists such as Audre Lorde, Sandra Botke, Eve Sedgwick, and Lauren Beland have all examined ways in which structural subordination of social groups is apparent not least in the affective constitution of individual and collective bodies of such groups. The title of this keynote conversation seems to invite reflections on a repertoire of mostly negative emotions on behalf of precarious subjects of advanced capitalist society, emotions proceeding from a shared experience of downward or sidewards mobility, insecurity, of social or distributional inequality as experienced from below, so to speak. But I would like to bring a somewhat different, yet perhaps no less significant structure of feeling to our table. Significant, at least in the Scandinavian context where I live and teach, namely the ugly feelings of unjust privilege. This structure of feeling, let's call it the predicament of privilege, also proceeds from a shared experience of distributional inequality, but from the opposite position. In contemporary Western public discourse and popular culture, the predicament of privilege and the troubling sensations of complicity, hypocrisy, guilt, grief, embarrassment, shame, and sheer exhaustion that tend to go with it takes up a lot of space, not least in the ways in which markets at once address this predicament and try to soothe the experience of it, as for instance in compassionate capitalism. As an effective interpretation of one's socioeconomic and geopolitically privileged position, this structure of feeling is in a sense opposite to the repertoire of austerity effects that we associate with precarity. But my own sense is that when thinking about effect and social change, much will be gained by examining effects of austerity and material privilege together. And I say that here in order for us just to stay a little with the fact that even in precarity, we're not equal, and that an imaginative anti-austerity politics will have to make claims for resource justice beyond the current austerity states of the US and Europe. And now it's my privilege and my pleasure to introduce our first speaker this afternoon, Professor in Human Geography at Durham University, Ben Anderson. For more than a decade, Ben Anderson's research has focused on how effects such as emergency, hope, and boredom form part of contemporary political and cultural life. His monograph from 2014, Encountering Effect, Capacities, Apparatuses, Conditions, is to my knowledge still the most comprehensive, detailed, and very helpful work on theories of effect. His current research focuses on the affective lives of neoliberalisms in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, Brexit, and in the midst of recent resurgence of populisms. His talk today engages with current forms of boredom. It stems from his ongoing research on new forms of boredom emerging in relation to digital life and their relation with forms of political disaffection. Please welcome Ben Anderson.
Okay, thank you so much for that generous introduction. My talk today starts from a problem. The problem of how do we think of change in relation to structures of feeling? How do we think of how structures of feeling emerge, endure, shift, and end? And I want to pose this kind of question, which is mostly in the background to the talk, in relation to the problem of boredom today. I want to ask what boredom is anymore. Does the boredom of regimented linear time, of machine-led factory conditions and administrative procedures and timetables still exist? Or have new boredoms emerged alongside other collective feelings that characterize a present frequently characterized under the sign of precarity and subject now to the emergence of various populisms of the left and right? When by precarious I mean forms of life, to quote Ong, that are without the promise of stability, in which indeterminacy and uncertainty, albeit unevenly distributed, albeit lived and felt in different ways, has become the norm. And as precarity spreads, to Goslar and Ballant's terms, some promises that were always out of reach for some have become increasingly fragile, some promises have ended, and new ones have gained traction. So in the midst of this emergence of indeterminacy, in the midst of this crisis and the promises offered and attached to, what becomes of boredom? And I'm interested in this question, at least initially, in relation to the curious non-place of boredom in explanations for the present. In those attempts to diagnose our turbulent, increasingly scarred moment in relation to Brexit, in relation to Trump and other events and conditions, boredom appears absent, as a kind of non-cathartic, flat feeling, as a feeling that settles over a situation or scene, like a warm, grey fabric, to quote Walter Benjamin. Boredom perhaps seems to belong to another time, There's always a real risk of making this kind of claim when you're talking about boredom. The problem is no longer, if it ever was today, the emptiness or emptying of time, but the fullness. The problem's the occupation of time as lines between work and life dissolve. Busyness, so often the counter to boredom alongside the interesting, appears to have become the norm. Burnout and other effects that are symptomatic of the desire, the compulsion, and the demand to be active seems to characterize our precarious times. And alongside affects of frenzy, of incessant activity, are collective feelings that speak to a crisis in those promises of social and economic betterment that were offered to some. Anger and hatred and rage and other strong moods that bubble and erupt and find expression in populist movements and figures. So in a time of differences, where a vocabulary of divides predominates and the excitement of antagonisms seems to characterize the present, the stilling, the slowing of boredom doesn't seem to quite fit. There's nothing dramatic about boredom. It doesn't bubble up, it settles. It captures us, it holds us. And yet my interest in boredom was occasioned by two scenes where boredom reoccurred in the context of trying to understand our populist present. The first was after the midterms in America. Amongst debates about what the results meant, had the Democrats won, had the Republicans won, what did this mean for the Trump project, Donald Trump professed he'd enjoyed the elections. He professed the results didn't matter. What mattered was they weren't boring anymore. You know, the midterm elections used to be like boring, didn't they? Do you even remember what they were? People say midterms, they say, what is that? What is that, right? Now it's like the hottest thing. And of course, part of the appeal of Trump is the form of violent fun that he offers. His capacity to enable people to once again enjoy their resentments, enjoy their hatreds. But perhaps something about his appeal is the shift from boredom that he enables. The second scene, where boredom kind of reoccurred in attempts to understand the present, followed from some work on Brexit that I'm doing with my friend and colleague Helen Wilson at Durham. We effectively did a series of interviews with people in the impasse between the referendum result and exit, or still potential, hopefully not exit. Yeah, you're allowed to boo every time I mention Brexit, by the way. That would work really well. That'll make me happy. Okay. But people talked about becoming bored of Brexit. People in the UK, whether Remain or Leave voters, talked about becoming bored. They talked about no longer paying attention as Brexit appeared on the news, no longer engaging with the political process. Brexit no longer being a topic of conversations amongst friends, amongst family. People had grown bored. To quote one person, Brexit had died a death. It had moved from a scene of attention and antagonism to be part of the background of life, to be occasionally attuned to, but mostly detached from. Of course, there are significant variations, which I can speak about more in questions. But there was a dissonance between, if you like, the importance of the event and these emerging forms of non-attention. And this mirrors, if you like, the form of the event in this impasse between referendum and exit. Seemingly unprecedented, seemingly momentous political events would happen, and nothing would happen. The impasse extends. The dramatic and the boring became so intimate. And recently, in the last few months, Brexit boredom has become a kind of phenomenon in the UK. It's been something that those campaigning for a second referendum attempt to jolt people out of, attempt to call on people to pay attention again. So in relation to Trump and in relation to Brexit, we gain a glimpse, perhaps no more, of the strange disruptive power of boredom, boredom's demonic power, to use Kierkegaard's phrase. And there's all kinds of traces of the power that boredom has in the archives of reflection on boredom and other forms of flat feeling, disinterest, apathy, and so on. Consider, for example, the threat that acedia, perhaps the precursor to boredom, was to spiritual life in the Christian tradition. Acedia was that which undermined prayer and meditation. It was a refusal of the joy that supposedly came from God's love, or to put differently, and in terms that hint as to why boredom matters. Acedia was an absence of care. Boredom's a threat in various spiritual traditions because it involves a turning away. It involves a detachment. And this takes us to why boredom matters, why it has a demonic power. Because in different ways and for different reasons, as people turned away from Brexit, or as people apparently turned away from politics pre-Trump, boredom teaches us about what we attach to and what we detach from. And it teaches us in particular about how our detachments are organized, how our detachments are channeled, and how our detachments are reproduced. So I'm interested in the forms that boredom takes today, and whether or not they are changing. At the very start of what will hopefully be a book project on contemporary forms of boredom, in particular boredom in relation to precarity and different forms of precaritization. But I'm really at the very beginning of that process. So what I'll offer for my remaining time is a series of speculations about what's happening to boredom, offered in the sense of an invitation for you to agree or disagree, contest, suggest otherwise. No more than that at this stage. Because not only does boredom tell us about how we attach and how we detach from something, it doesn't only tell us about how care is distributed and our attention, boredom also tells us about the distribution of possibility, about how that which is novel or that which is new is felt and can be related to as part of different forms of life. But in posing this question of what is boredom today and how does boredom change, we reach a challenge for any attempt to diagnose collective feelings. How to think about change in a structure of feeling. If we presume that any present moment has within it and is constituted through a plurality of structures of feeling. If a structure of feeling is, in Raymond Williams' terms, simultaneously a forming and formative process and a characteristic pattern, then how to think of change in that characteristic pattern? And of course, this challenge of how do we think about change is made explicit by Williams in his kind of topological understanding of different forms that affective presences take, some of which are dominant, some of which are residual, some of which are emerging, some of which are pre-emergent, to hint at what Becky will talk about later. But of course, the challenge of change is in the very phrase structure of feeling, to put it really simply. It's in the tension between the durability of structure, the sense that structures ossify and solidify, and the ephemerality of feeling. The feelings can and do take flight. They move as they move us. And of course, the term itself that Williams was always hesitant about. At various points, he substitutes structure of experience for structure of feeling. At another point, patterns of feeling, which connects to his anthropology, the background to the term structures of feeling. He's always hesitant about the term precisely because how it holds together the durable, that which repeats, and that which changes. Or the kind of intimacy between form and that which deforms and kind of reforms simultaneously. And I think many of the attempts, which I know have been in the background to some of the sessions and workshops and study groups in this festival, to play with the term structures of feeling, to rework it. Sarah Ahmed's Feelings of Structure. Lauren Ballant's Structures of Unfeeling. Infrastructure of Feeling by Becky. They're all in different ways trying to hold on to this tensed relation between form and that which deforms or unfolds. Now, of course, kind of like here is where we return back to boredom, and why boredom matters. Because to think structures of feeling, plural structures of feeling in relation to boredom, is to return to that question of the organization of our detachments, what we turn away from and how we turn away. So we can think about this problem of change in relation to boredom by beginning from a particular proposition. That is that a certain type of boredom, or more precisely, a certain type of modernist boredom, is either ending or becoming residual. And it's ending or becoming residual in the wake of, if you like, on the one hand, forms of precaritization, which, whilst there are clearly differences between them, all make the relation between present and future unstable and intensify the uncertainty in that relation. On the one hand, precaritization, on the other hand, what we could term massified individualism. Through the different forms of networked subjectivity emerging in the midst of digital infrastructures and platforms. So in the midst of these two kind of imbricated but not equivalent processes, has a particular form of boredom ended. This is boredom as the boredom of tedium, emergent from, settling in the midst of process of routinalization and standardized reproduction, and organized into particular scenes, factory labor and housework, unfolding with particular forms of life which have their characteristic spatialities, suburbia, for example. And as we know, various political movements, various genres of music and art from the 1960s onwards named and were cast in opposition to this form of boredom and its emptying of time. We can think about the role of boredom in punk music. London's burning with boredom, the Clash sang. I was thinking about this the other day. It would be very, and of course London here just stands in for kind of like any metropolis, any large city. And of course, would this kind of claim, would it be possible to make this kind of claim today about our cities? I don't know. London's burning with boredom, sung the Clash, amplifying the critique of boredom by the situationalists who, to quote, boredom is always counter-revolutionary. The protest being against the mediocrity, the vapidity, the apathy of existence. There was a kind of horror of boredom here, emergent from a kind of anguished boredom, rather than a contented boredom that animated and drove punk music, connected up with other critiques of boredom at the time. We could think about the very different critique of the problem with no name in first wave feminism. So what's happened to this form of boredom and its counter-energies, even if we presume that there was never only one form of boredom previously, that there were many other minor or residual forms coexisting? Has Fordist boredom and horror at boredom as a structure of feeling, the dream of an escape from that form of boredom, has that form of boredom ended or become residual? And I think we can sense that something might be changing in the ambivalent status of boredom today. Noting, of course, that boredom has always been a really disquieting effect and affect. It's always been unclear whether boredom is to be welcomed and celebrated or boredom is symptomatic of some kind of absence, or whether it's both simultaneously. Is boredom promise or threat? Because boredom's always had a kind of tensed relation with the new or novel, a tensed relation with the opening up of the present to possibility that very often accompanies boredom. As we detach, so the possibility of new attachments emerge. These may be expressed in new music genres and political movements, or it might be expressed in daydreams and doodles. Either way, boredom is closely connected to the promise and the search for an exit. So it's always been a kind of, there's always been an ambivalent and kind of tensed critical relationship with boredom. But of course, we hear something might be changing to boredom in many of the diagnoses of what someone like Mark Fisher might call the dominant reactive effect of contemporary neoliberal capitalism. Take burnout, for example, as an affect of exhaustion that, in Josh Cohen's terms, oscillates between, and I quote, an intense yearning for a state of rest, alongside the sense that it cannot be attained, that there is always some demand or anxiety or distraction that won't let them go. Boredom would seem to be the opposite to burnout as a phenomenon, boredom being a letting go, a detachment, even if one feels held captive by the thing which bores. We hear this same kind of anxieties about whether boredom is present or absent, whether something is changing, in the anxieties that surface around distracted subjects for whom empty time no longer exists, as they're caught within a kind of tsunami of clicks, likes, views, scrolls, and so on, as lines between activity and passivity begin to blur. And yet in all these claims that boredom might be changing, maybe, there's still ambivalence. There's still an uncertainty about what, if anything, has happened to boredom. Is boredom too present, or is boredom too absent? Is boredom present in worlds of work today? Worlds of work which no longer have the promise of betterment associated with them? Or is it too absent in the context of total entertainment? The kind of always on, always switched on subject. And even if boredom is present or is absent, is its presence or its absence to be celebrated or lamented? What potential, if any, resides in boredom today? So as I move towards conclusion, as I said, the wider book project is going to try and kind of think through different relations between forms of boredom in the aftermath of this perhaps shift from a particular imbrication of boredom with some of the social and economic processes associated with Fordism. And it's going to try and connect up boredom to different forms of precaritization and different forms of precarious life. And so, rather than actually have done this work yet, what I've produced here is what can only be described as a fairly boring PowerPoint, black and white PowerPoint slides with a kind of a list of various different forms that boredom today might take. Let's take the top one then, lingering boredoms of the margins. So much of the discourse on boredom today presumes this, as I did at the start, the incessantness of activity. What gets kind of written out here, potentially, are the boredoms which follow from having nothing to do. The boredoms for those who are in or underemployment, and yet still remain in the ambient, remain in the orbit, if you like, of some of the dreams of activity. We might think about the same way in which boredom is tolerated as a part of people's attempt to reproduce, attempt to enable something they've optimistically attached to. We might think about how boredom relates to situations where promises have been frustrated or not realized. We might think, for example, of a mild yearning for boredom amongst some, where boredom is symptomatic of a desire for rest, for respite. How does boredom surface in those situations where lines between work and play have become completely blurred? Then we might think about the relation between boredom and the anticipation of the settling of boredom that happens alongside the pseudo-events of clicking. So we might say that for some forms of life, perhaps boredom never exists. What exists today is the feeling of the possibility of boredom that is soon interrupted by the next scroll through a newsfeed, the distracted check of a phone. Various forms of boredom, perhaps. In conclusion, in a short essay that I absolutely love by Adam Phillips, he describes boredom in these terms. Boredom as a state of suspended anticipation, in which things are started and nothing begins. Things are started, but nothing begins. The quote reminds me of why I think boredom matters today. Boredom doesn't only matter because it follows from and is kind of symptomatic of the emptiness of time time emptied and emptying of meaning and purpose and value, although of course it matters for that reason, I think. Boredom also matters for me because staying with our boredoms teaches us about what we attach to and what we detach from, and how our detachments and attachments are organized. But more precisely, why staying with our boredoms for me matters is because it teaches us about how we relate to the new or novel, how various forms of life may be tense today between starting something and beginning, when beginning refers to the introduction of the new or novel, or the genuinely unexpected. And on that note, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben, for this very rich and generous talk, opening up the repertoire of contemporary boredoms for us. I'm really looking forward to our conversation later. Our next keynote speaker will pick up upon the digital mediation of temporalities and affectivities of the present by developing further Williams' conceptual framework. Rebecca Coleman is reader in the sociology department at Goldsmiths, University of London, where she researches and teaches across sociology, media and cultural studies, and feminist theory on topics such as visual sociology, bodies and materiality, temporality, and inventive methodologies, on which she has all published widely. Rebecca Coleman's current research project is called Mediating Presence, Producing the Now in Contemporary Digital Culture. And here she explores how digital media produce, pattern, and regulate a present temporality, focusing exactly on affect and materiality. Rebecca Coleman is also at work on a book provisionally titled Glitter Worlds, The Future Politics of a Ubiquitous Thing. And in this book, she follows glitter across a range of popular worlds, including mainstream girls' culture and LGBTQ activist glitter bombing. The title of Rebecca Coleman's talk this afternoon is Infrastructures of Feeling, Digital Media, Pre-Emergence, and Collective Moods. Please welcome Rebecca Coleman.
Okay, hi, thank you. I'm partway through a project on digital media presence, or how today a significant temporality is the now, or actually what I'm kind of interested in is how there are a range of nows. As part of this, I've been interviewing digital media professionals, so people who work with media as social media managers, digital directors, and as part of artistic and creative collectives. We've been talking about digital media in terms of liveness and real-timeness, considering what these terms refer to, and discussing their inherent variability and kind of how they are malleable or kind of flexible. We've also been talking about the feelings that their management of digital media generates in terms of these temporal qualities. So I think there are connections with some of the things that Ben was talking about. So some of the people I've been kind of speaking with have been talking about this kind of feeling of frenzy. A lot have talked about burnout and about developing new kind of new techniques and strategies for dealing with how they kind of engage with and digital media, how digital media are part of their everyday lives. So one social media manager that I interviewed a couple of months ago discussed what he called mindless scrolling and how, quote, it depletes your capacity to focus on anything else. So it becomes a solution to the fact that you can't focus. The more you are using it, the more it stops you from focusing, and you just fall into this kind of mindless scroll, which of course is something that very smart people have sat around trying to design as an intended outcome. This kind of constant refreshing of data then suggests that there's no end to the stream. There is always more emerging or capable of being made to emerge. Another interviewee kind of discussed refreshing content and saying, I think conceptually you're sitting in the current moment, but you're anxious to get to the next thing. So you scroll up to see what's happened. And he talked about this in terms of FOMO and how this is a kind of a really prevalent feeling. Another talked about how messaging apps such as Slack contributed to a sense of feeling literally always on all the time. And another referred to how their team designed social media posts designed to pique the interest of those who are just looking for something, anything. We might place these explanations and kind of discussions alongside other examples, as diverse perhaps, as the ways in which how some people move around a city is tracked through Metro cards or Apple Pay, providing companies with the capacity to know not only where we are, but also to better understand and predict where we might go. Or how on Netflix and other streaming services the next program begins before the last one has finished. Or how on Fitbit a user can set goals for themselves in the future based on the data collected on them in the past. So these disparate practices may be understood as generating that which is, and at the same time is not quite yet. They are what I understand, drawing on Raymond Williams's work, as techniques and moods that circulate around pre-emergence. So what I want to do for a bit now is kind of go through some of what I've found really helpful and productive in Raymond Williams' essays, Structures of Feeling, and also some other ones that I think kind of connect with it. So I think there are some links here to be made with other sessions in the festival, including the workshop that I went to yesterday, the Affective Infrastructures study group, and kind of the discussions they've been having. So I see this as kind of adjacent to or kind of connecting with some of those kinds of discussions. So in his essays, Structures of Feeling, Williams argues for an understanding of culture and society as processually structured and for a mode of analysis capable of attending to the active, flexible, temporal present rather than fixed forms. His concept of structure of feeling seeks to emphasize a distinction from more formal concepts of worldview or ideology, and proposes an approach concerned with meanings and values as they are actively lived and felt. It also seeks to account, as we've heard, for a particular quality of social experience and relationship historically distinct from other particular qualities, which gives the sense of a generation or a period. I'll come back and talk about these ideas a bit later on. So Williams's work focuses on how a particular structure of feeling is generated by textual forms. So in the essay The Welsh Industrial Novel, for example, he describes how the novels of the 19th and 20th century both attest to and create a specifically Welsh structure of feeling that comes from the physical characteristics of Welsh industrial areas and the social relations and historical events that have come to constitute the working life there. He tracks the development of this genre of writing, explaining how it moves from the experience of mass industrialisation in Wales to its observation. And it is only when it is able to observe rather than experience or kind of internalise or kind of feel the situation that it becomes a coherent genre. And I think this kind of relationship or perhaps distinction between experience and observation in terms of this idea of genre is perhaps something interesting, and we might talk about it later on. Important in Williams' argument is the beginnings of the Welsh industrial novel as a textual form that can be understood as part of what he calls an emergent culture, a not yet fully articulated idea or image that hovers at the edge of semantic availability. Crucially, even before they are delineated and defined, such emergent cultures inform, limit, and direct experience and action, constituting this structure of feeling that works in relation to residual and dominant cultures. And this is something Ben also kind of gestured towards. So I want to kind of unpack more this idea of emergent culture. So in the essay Dominant, Residual and Emergent, Williams defines dominant culture as hegemonic and residual culture as that which has been effectively formed in the past but is still active in the cultural process, not only and often not at all as an element of the past, but as an effective element of the present. So residual culture is somehow still present. While some aspects of residual culture may well be incorporated into dominant culture, certain experiences, meanings and values remain distinct from and may be oppositional and alternative to it. His understanding of emergent culture is defined as such, and this is the long quote on the slides. By emergent, I mean first, that new meanings and values, new practices, new relationships and kinds of relationship are continually being created. But it is exceptionally difficult to distinguish between those which are really elements of some new phase of the dominant culture and those which are substantially alternative or oppositional to it. Emergent in the strict sense rather than merely novel. Since we are always considering relations within a cultural process, definitions of the emergent as of the residual can be made only in relation to a full sense of the dominant. For Williams then, here, emergent culture indicates the potentiality of novelty, that is, substantially alternative or oppositional to the hegemony of dominant culture. More specifically, Williams distinguishes between what he calls emergent culture and that which is pre-emergent. So there's a kind of another term or another sense or quality of a structure of feeling that he introduces. He says, what matters finally in understanding emergent culture as distinct from both the dominant and the residual is that it is never only a matter of immediate practice. Indeed, it depends crucially on finding new forms or adaptations of form. Again and again, what we have to observe is in effect a pre-emergence, active and pressing, but not yet fully articulated, rather than the evident emergence which could be more confidently named. So crucially then here, Williams is placing particular emphasis on the pre-emergent, arguing that it is to understand more closely this condition of pre-emergence, as well as the more evident forms of the emergent, the residual and the dominant, that we need to explore the concept of structures of feeling. So this idea of pre-emergence then is absolutely central to how we can kind of designate or identify and understand a structure of feeling. And this idea of pre-emergence is that which is at the edge of semantic availability and hence is not and cannot be yet fully articulated. So I think there are kind of two issues that are raised here. And first is to think about this idea about pre-emergence, what it might involve. And a second is like how we might develop ways, theories, methodologies, kind of approaches, practices for kind of grasping this pre-emergence. What I want to suggest is that what Williams identifies as the significance of pre-emergent to the media culture he analyses is with digital media kind of even more salient, or it becomes kind of intensified. So the brief and partial examples I began with, and there are many more of them I'm sure, indicate what I see as a kind of pre-emergence, what Mark Hansen calls a presentification, which is at once a feeding forward. So it's kind of a present and a future, or a present that is kind of oriented around this kind of sense of nextness. Or put another way, what he and Patricia Clough and her colleagues understand in terms of prehension, a concept drawn from Whitehead that captures, among other things, a sense of just beforeness, a mode of grasping and attuning to the world that is material and corporal, that is felt and that is emergent. It's what kind of, I think Williams is describing as this that hovers at the edge of semantic availability. Pre-emergence then may be understood as designating today's structure of feeling. It designates, or it kind of spreads across a particular generation or period. Importantly for Williams, pre-emergence holds the possibility for an oppositional or resistant culture. What happens, though, when pre-emergent is not distinct from, but absolutely central to dominant culture, indeed how dominant culture functions? When key organisations and institutions, from governments to Amazon to Facebook, function in terms of producing, managing and analysing pre-emergence? What might resistance or opposition consist of or involve? How might a pre-emergent quality, which is not yet comprehended but is felt, sometimes as this kind of anxious alertness or a kind of always-onness, how is this to be kind of mobilised? Is resistance the most helpful term to think with today? Do we need to find different emergent or pre-emergent forms, or turn to residual cultures? So I want to begin to answer these questions or address these questions. Again, I'm kind of in the midst of a project, so I'm thinking with and through these ideas now. But I think kind of pushing or developing Williams's concept of structure of feeling into an understanding of infrastructures of feeling might be helpful. This is partly because there's currently a lot of work which understands digital media in terms of infrastructures. So last month, a special issue of Media and Culture and Society, the journal, has just been published, which I've not yet read, but it kind of argues for this understanding of digital media in terms of infrastructures. So a lot of this is concerned with how media are connected and work through or fail through, as we heard in the workshop yesterday, through an architecture of platforms, devices and other technologies. And this is partly what I mean by infrastructures of feeling, so how the qualities of digital media and pre-emergence are created, organised and patterned via these networks. What I'm also interested in, though, is how the infra of infrastructures gestures towards affect or feeling. Indeed, the term infrastructure has recently been mobilised to refer not only to technological and kind of institutional connectivity, but also to the affective dimensions of culture and society. And, this connects with Williams' idea of the structure of feeling, which he proposes because he argues the social has become associated with fixity and pastness, and what he wants to consider is this kind of liveness and change. I'm interested in whether and how we might push the definition of infra as under or below to refer to before or prior or pre, in the sense that pre-emergence is this active and pressing but not yet fully articulated kind of condition or quality, a kind of affectivity that registers and might not yet quite make sense. So this idea in affect studies as well around, or this debate in affect studies around the pre, I think it would be interesting to think more about here. So this idea has been developed in recent social and cultural theory by Clough, who argues for an attention to the infra-empirical. That is, how the activity of our world today, to a large extent, takes place at time-space scales far finer than those of human perception, at the probabilistic scale of affect. For Clough here, the social today operates not so much in terms of ideological interpolation or subject formation, but through affective modulation and individuation. So the infra here attends to how this is a social modulated through affective capacities at the edges of perception and consciousness. So, and despite their kind of different approaches, in both Clough and Williams's arguments, is this kind of idea that we need to kind of rethink ideology and how kind of power and the individual is kind of constituted today. So affect is this kind of excessive mode of power. Lauren Ballant has also discussed affective infrastructures, and again, this was kind of one of the things that brought the affective infrastructures study group together. In her case, she examines how infrastructures are that which bind people together and are involved in the formation of a collective, which might never come together in a stable way. So this idea of a collective not as something necessarily unified or cohesive or even enduring, but as something perhaps temporary, perhaps kind of vague. Infrastructures, she argues, are both symbolic and practical, straddling the conceptual and material organisation of life, and they organise nextness and vague senses of the projected out future. These senses of the affects of infrastructures are helpful, I think, to grasp and understand the qualities of pre-emergence. So the social movements that are organised through social media, for example, so from Black Lives Matter to alt-right groups or kind of fascist groups, are much more dispersed and temporary than this. And Carolyn Pedwell has been working on these kinds of ideas recently. So they come together perhaps briefly and they work across and between the material and symbolic, as Ballant suggests. So they're not a genre, as Williams describes them, observable and becoming dominant, nor are they necessarily pre-emergent in the oppositional sense. So the fascist movements, as they are constituted through digital media, are also pre-emergent. Beyond digital media, there's also a sense of collectives operating in these imprecise or fraying ways, as kind of Ben's talked about in relation to boredom. So what I think I'm suggesting here is both that it is necessary to consider how collective feelings are produced through infrastructures. So this idea of kind of maybe pushing structures of feeling towards this understanding of infrastructures of feeling, and also that thinking infrastructurally, where infrastructure refers to affect as well as networks and connections, may be a helpful means of understanding and perhaps developing means of intervening in today's dominant qualities. That's it.
Thank you so much, both of you, for these very generous observations and arguments. I would like to begin our discussion by posing one clarifying question to each of you, if that's okay. Perfect. Ben, I was thinking that it seems to me that you find boredom in places where others would perhaps find social or political depression, powerlessness, fatigue. So maybe we could talk a bit more about the distinctions between boredom and you know, other negative emotions like apathy, powerlessness, because I think one way of distinguishing between boredom and powerlessness, for instance, could be that in boredom there's a critical evaluation. In boredom there's a critical evaluation of an object. That object is not exciting enough, lively enough, or big enough That's why we don't want to be boring persons, right? Because we know it's a negative evaluation of our value, basically. Whereas in political depression or powerlessness, it's more like, wow, that object is just too big for me. So the critical evaluation is more of the self and its diminished capacities. So that would be one way of distinguishing between apathy and boredom. But it seems to me that you, in your framework, they're actually more close. So maybe, yeah. So the critical evaluation is not really part of your thinking on boredom.
Okay, thank you. I was slightly weirded out by using a mic, for whatever reason, but never mind. Okay, this is a really important question. I mean, I guess my starting point would be very often the indistinction of the various affects or emotions we gather together under the category of kind of like the negative. And so I guess I'd pause to think, okay, what work does parsing out and what kinds of definitional work should we do or would we want to do in relation to that? I think there's also something, that's a kind of general point, and of course not a terribly novel one. But I think the more important point is that the boredom is a very odd occasion to reflect upon, because as soon as you begin from boredom, there very often leads to a lack of certainty about whether it is boredom which is being felt or something else. And you see this in the long history of reflection on boredom. The various authors get to the point of not quite knowing whether it's boredom or whether it's a kind of repressed anger that boredom kind of dampens, or whether it's frustration and a kind of impatient frustration at a process or in relation to something. There's a lot of reflection on the boredom of bureaucracy and how that becomes kind of impatient frustration. So I think as well as that kind of meta point of how do you pass within the negative emotions, as it were, there's also something particular about boredom that it escapes kind of our capacity to hold on to it. It's always potentially becoming something else, which of course leads to a very significant methodological challenge that I've not reflected upon in this talk, which is a double one of how do you engage with that slippage where boredom is always becoming something else, but also how do you attempt to become interested in that which interrupts interest, and how do you bring to presence, as all methods do, how do you bring to presence that which slips away as soon as you begin to reflect upon it. Albeit this is one particular form of boredom, the fleeting. Now, to go to your specific point about your kind of proposition, as it were, about what is it that distinguishes boredom. I mean, I would actually hold to at least the form of boredom that we know and are comfortable with, in the sense that we can give an account of it, involving very often a distinction from something external that bores. And so that distinction from the thing which bores, such as someone talking now about boredom, the distinction from the thing which bores, very often involves, as I would agree, a negative evaluation of and a process of externalization. Now, you could imagine here about how boredom and powerlessness are not mutually exclusive in this context, because kind of one response to that sense of being overwhelmed by that which holds or that which represents a particular form of power would be to detach from it and detach from one's powerlessness through rendering it as the object which bores. So this is why I go back to my starting point, that in some ways the indeterminacy between boredom and the negative emotions is partly because I think of the work that boredom can do in relation to some of those other negative. So in relation to apathy, let's say, you don't have to inhabit the subject position of the apathetic subject if your apathy is connected to that you have an object which bores, that you can distinguish yourself from. So.
Okay, that's really helpful, because I'm thinking, discursively, when you're discussing with a friend, oh, that's just so boring, then there's a kind of arrogance in that, right? Then we're trying to control the object and sort of putting it we know what that is. We don't want to go there. So, okay, but you're doing something different in a sense with it.
No, I don't think I would be very different to that.
No.
I think if it's kind of interesting, in that scenario, for me there would be a refusal to engage with the possibilities and promises that object offers, which makes this point about detachment and turning away from.
Yeah, great. So one clarifying question, Rebecca, because you describe so well this culture of pre-emergence, sort of a digital culture of pre-emergence, which includes also preemption, prediction, and all the other pre's, more or less. But I was just thinking, isn't that something very distinct from what Williams called a pre-emergent culture? So, of course, we have to at some point talk about the technical vocabulary of Williams, and when thinking about affect in general, all these structures, infrastructures, which is. But I was just thinking, maybe you could distinguish between a pre-emergent culture, which is what Williams is interested in, and then a culture of pre-emergence, which is really sort of what we see as dominant today.
That's a really interesting question. Thank you. And I think partly kind of what I'm interested in doing with this project is kind of thinking about those different pre-words as well. So preemption, prediction, prehension. So there's kind of quite so what the pre kind of refers to there. So this, and in the context of affect studies as well, and the debate within affect studies about whether and how affect can be pre-cognition, emotion, pre-cultural, all of those kinds of debates. So you've put your finger on exactly kind of what I'm interested in. I think one of the things I found helpful or interesting about Williams's argument about pre-emergence is this this idea that something is not settled. It's not kind of necessarily what we can grasp or kind of take hold of, and also this idea that you know, writing in the kind of 70s and 80s, this idea that pre-emergence is not just novel or new, but it is this kind of this space for kind of opposition and resistance. And so that's why I've been kind of interested in thinking about this as a culture of pre-emergence, but also then in trying to kind of think more, or that's kind of what I want to do, is think more about then what that suggests for his more critical idea about pre-emergence and a kind of politics. So what might a politics and an ethics be around that? So I've not answered your question directly, but that's exactly the kinds of things that I'm interested in thinking about.
Oh, okay, yeah. No, that's very helpful. Yeah, so many places we could go from here. I just have, I'm curious to know something. What is the evidential status of affect and emotion in your work, respectively? And I ask this question because it's something that always comes up in sort of affect theory, and Lauren Berland is really difficult here because she has this thing about, Berland, that you both engage with, that we shouldn't trust our feelings too much, and it's just so weird. So I was just wondering whether, for instance, effects of precariousness, when you feel precarious, is that a proof that you're being precarious? So, and I guess it has consequences for when we're talking about collective moods in times of precariousness or precarious times. So just whether you think of affect as, testimony to something, or how you engage with it. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Again, I think that's exactly what I'm kind of interested in. So my route to kind of thinking about affect is through feminist theory, and I think the struggle or the debate around affect and emotion is particularly kind of intense there for various reasons, partly because of the justifiable emphasis that feminists have placed on culture as a way in which woman or femininity is kind of made. So then, what does it happen if we think about affect as something that's pre-cultural? and also because of the long history of feminist work on kind of emotion and kind of cultural forms as well, so around kind of melodrama or romance or those sorts of things. So that's my route into affect studies. I think, you know, one of the ways that I've been trying to think about your question is what it implies or kind of requires us to do methodologically, so not only kind of theoretically. I don't want to make a clear divide between theory and methodology or theory and practice, but as Ben was just saying, like, how do you grasp these things that might not be kind of able to be articulated through discourse or might not be able to be organised into narrative. So that's been, that's kind of one of the things that I find really problematic, or a central problem, and very productive to kind of to think and work with. And in this latest project I'm doing, I'm interviewing people. But the next stage of the project is to try to develop some more kind of sensory and kind of digital methods for kind of trying to grasp that idea of the present as something that slips away as soon as you try to grasp it, but also for the affectivity of the present. Yeah.
That's going to be very important. We're happy to learn more about that.
Yeah,
hard, but important.
Yeah, this is a really challenging question, in part because I've always been very sceptical and critical of two ways in which evidence has tended to function in some affect kind of theory-influenced work. On the one hand, and I was kind of in danger of becoming part of this genre today a little, I think, the, if you like, speculation about the kind of affective conditions of the contemporary, which pays very little attention to kind of what, rather than evidence, I'd call kind of like different forms of empiricism. And here I kind of think some of the work on kind of affect coming out of the various kind of Marxist traditions are susceptible to this critique, actually. And then the other form of evidence in which has been used,
which for example,
the kind of autonomous Marxist traditions, the Boredoms, this kind of work. I've always thought that work is in real danger of making a series of seemingly empirical claims about the contemporary in the absence of almost any what you would consider to be situated work. That people in the audience may significantly disagree with that. But also, I've been really sceptical about the tendency within certain kind of affect theory, more the kind of political theory side of things, the William Connolly's work, to effectively borrow legitimacy from neuroscience in relation to these debates around affect as the precognitive. And so both of those forms of evidencing, I guess, as befits my kind of background as a social scientist, that I'm kind of sceptical of. How I think about kind of evidence then starts from kind of what the problem in relation to affect is for me. And the problem for me is not really being the kind of the indeterminacy and the contingency of affective life. It's not really being the kind of like the affect indicates or kind of like points to something other or different. I've been really interested in the classic question of how a particular kind of affective energies organised and reproduced in particular social spatial formations which are always already affective. So the problem has always been at the start, the question of organisation for me, which is not necessarily the starting place for others. What this means is that I'm really, what follows from that is that I'm interested in the patterns and forms and processes through which that organisation happens, which means that there's no, if you like, there's no kind of pure affect. There's always affect as articulated with this or that. So for me, any and all method potentially enables you to relate somehow to that process of organisation. But it's a question of what the somehow is differently across methods. So it's almost like when you talk about kind of affect theory, there's also, and you almost had it, Becky, it's like a hesitancy to say, oh, I'm doing interviews. But I think kind of like there's something in kind of like the tone of voice, the rhythm of speech, the ways in which certain words act as kind of like placeholders that become commonly agreed and recognised, that you have a trace of, a translation of that organisation of affect. And I think for every method, it's a question of working out what is the trace and what is the translation of affect.
Yeah, and just to add kind of who, what the problem is as well, and who. So the interviews I've been doing are with you know, highly educated people who think a lot about these things, and they are very articulate at kind of talking about these kinds of ideas. Whether or not that would be the case with whoever you worked with, or that there would be differences in doing, you know, that the methods would generate stuff, materials that would do that kind of work of articulation differently. So yeah, there's the thinking about what methods are appropriate to the problem that you're trying to kind of work out, and with whom or with what, I think.
And I think that's a really nice way of putting it, like the question of articulation and different forms of research material. There's one thing I've been really inspired by your work, almost like the multiplication of what counts as a research material, and how different forms of research material, you know, I'm used to working with, if you like, voice and observation, like classic kind of like ethnography, participant observation, and then kind of analysis of various textual forms. And all those generate, of course, certain kinds of research material which contain traces and translations. But I really love your expansion of what counts as research material.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's some very nice observations, I think, and helpful for all of us. This Friday, Jeremy Gilbert talked about the tone of voice as the place to where to locate affective charts. And Williams himself talks about literary style, right? So we have the genre style, tonalities. Okay, yes, I think we would like to have some questions from the audience as well. I'm sure many of you have things that you would like to ask, and we want to give you time for that. So please, there are 3 microphones that you can line up behind when you have a question to ask. And in the meantime, we can go somewhere else, maybe. That's good. I was thinking, oh, there's someone. Okay, perfect, thank you.
Don't let me stop you, though, if you...
No, I can do that afterwards, please.
So my question has to do with textual forms and the kind of, this question of methodologies. I was really interested in the slide, Rebecca, that you showed about Raymond Williams and his look at the Welsh industrial novel and his sort of textual analysis of that. And I wondered about the literary now and how, like, if there's a particular part of the literary now, like a particular literary field in which the pre-emergent is being rendered and sort of our experience can be sort of is being apprehended in literature as what that which escapes narrative, and that seems to me something that novelists, poets, but also like, is it media art that we look to instead of the literary now as a dominant sort of or most relevant artistic form?
Yeah. Thanks. I can't answer your question about literary forms. That's not what I've been kind of looking at, although it's sparked some thoughts about novels I've been reading recently, and yeah, I would need to think more about that. I think, yes, a lot of people are looking towards a kind of digital media, digital arts. My work tends to focus on, or has tended to focus on visual culture. So I've been looking mainly at kind of images in terms of mass media images, but also trying to think about images more broadly. So some of the methods I've been using or developing have been with young women, so teenagers, who are often seen as kind of particularly affected by media, particularly susceptible to being affected, and unable to affect back. So and kind of working with them to generate their own images. So that's been kind of the way in which I've kind of tried to think about that kind of question. I don't know if you'd have anything to say about textual forms and genre. I was thinking about your work on genre.
Yeah, I mean, not a huge amount on this actually, other than to note that there is obviously kind of modernist literature is a huge repository for attempting to make articulate the experience of a certain kind of repressed boredom, in particular in relation to women's boredom. But in some ways, in relation to the work I'm doing, it's distinguished a little from this. I'm probably less interested in like what are the textual forms today to try and understand kind of boredom. I'm more interested in what are the reading practices today. How have reading practices changed such that the boring surfaces and is related to whether that's you endure the boring or you move away very quickly from that which bores. And I'm more interested in that question of almost like the event of boredom, even though boredom is radically non-evental, the event of boredom in reading practices and how reading practices shift. But
yeah, I guess also in terms of the ways in which kind of writing, I'm thinking of kind of texting or messaging and kind of emojis and how they are often you know, seen as some kind of inferior form of writing or text or communication, and the connection there with the idea of like the distracted kind of reader, which is usually always kind of posed in negative ways.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think that it's worth sort of there is a current literary sort of trend for that kind of language being like introduced into like, you know, like alt-lit and Sally Rooney's
I
like
was thinking of
so it's
Rooney,
almost like I think it's really interesting where the sort of the modernist interest in like boredom and sort of what like forms of language that would normally not be literary being now brought into what is actually today's realist fiction that is sort of now sort of textually boring or repetitive or sort of the kinds of language that we wouldn't normally throw away. But
thanks.
yeah, and I think in relation to that, it's really interesting how flatness and what kind of flatness is in communication kind of shifts. I'm sort of reminded of a friend saying that my text communication is sometimes flat. It's not as kind of like dramatic, perhaps, as it could be. And I think this kind of how that form of flatness gets reproduced in that kind of new literary genre is really interesting.
We have one more question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks very much. I thought both of those talks were incredibly interesting, and for me personally, very, very new areas, and I could see lots of interesting areas of inquiry. In particular, though, Rebecca, I was drawn in particularly to what you were saying about the infrastructures of feeling and this combination of both the technical structure and the emotional structure. But I kind of felt as I was getting more and more drawn in, it just stopped just as we get into the exciting bit of how do we apply this? Well, I mean, using this frame, and that's quite a big question, I know. But I wondered if you could sort of maybe articulate a couple of examples of how this infrastructure of feeling can be applied to all of the sort of unfiltered emotional landscape we find all around us in the digital sphere.
Thanks. That's exactly what I'm trying to work out. I've kind of I developed it in relation to some of these ideas about nextness. So, for example, on Twitter and on Netflix, and how they operate through this idea of there's always something next. And to think about that in relation to the folding in of the future and the present. So I've kind of been thinking about it in temporal terms and the kind of affectivity of that. I think the idea, I think I need to think more about infrastructure, and this was one of the things I was thinking about in the Affective Infrastructures workshop yesterday, and how the different provocations that were kind of offered there by people working in different practices and different disciplines and with different intentions or different purposes. So I think that's, I'm sorry, I'm aware I'm saying this a lot, but it is this is kind of exactly what I am thinking about now. So how to develop that idea of infrastructure so that affect and infrastructure aren't seen as separate things. So it's not that an infrastructure is producing or creating or organising affect, although that is part of it, but it's also how infrastructures are affective. So I think that's that's kind of, yeah, that's what I'm interested in. Yeah, that's where I am right now.
Thank you very much. So we also have to do a bit of time management, but we have one last question this afternoon, please.
Thank you very much. This is a question to Ben regarding boredom. We have now the possibility 24 hours of entertainment, medially. So I'm thinking of my son. So when there is no time for being bored, what is lacking in, let's say, what comes out of boredom, you know, the more creative part, for instance. So did you thought about that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, in some ways, the question goes to the heart of why thinking about boredom matters. Because traditionally, as I said in the talk, boredom's had like a really ambivalent relationship with creativity. So the detachment from something which follows from, which is boredom, and the kind of like emptiness of the moment of boredom, the presumption is that that detachment of that emptiness is the precursor to creative acts. And therefore, the absence of boredom in the scenario that you articulated is to be lamented, because you presume the absence of boredom equals the absence of creativity. Now, the first thing I'd say in response would be, I'm not sure I know enough about what happens to boredom for those who are constantly plugged into that kind of world of entertainment and have grown up in that way. So this is why I kind of speculated that, okay, what may exist there is not boredom, but something new that in the terms we've used today is on the edge of semantic availability. The feeling of the anticipation of the possibility of boredom and its immediate mediation by some kind of activity. So boredom never settles. What settles is always is the feeling that boredom may happen. Not quite the same thing. So if that is the case, then I don't know what's the relationship between that anticipation of boredom and creativity. Maybe there is a relation there that like I haven't thought about or don't know about. The second thing I'd say is that I've always felt that this presumption of the relation between boredom and creativity was coming from a really very particular form of life. It was an assumption made where, in relation to a form of life which had the possibility of something else, had the kind of like material or symbolic resources or affective resources to be creative. So this is why I'm always quite skeptical about the sort of the celebration of boredom, because boredom is the precursor to creativity. Well, perhaps for certain forms of life, perhaps for certain articulations of boredom, but perhaps not for those forms of life where boredom is to be endured because there isn't the possibility of escape or exit. So in other words, I see this kind of question, I see this whole problem of, should we celebrate boredom's absence? Should we lament its absence? Is boredom absent? As really symptomatic of a kind of change which is happening that we don't know quite what to make of at the moment. And whether new forms of creativity are emerging in relation to these experiences which are almost but not quite boredom as it once was. The digitally mediated forms of boredom is for me an empirical question that I want to analyse. But thank you for getting at the heart of what I'm interested in.
Thank you. I think that was a really important point to make here, that our evaluations of different effects and emotions are actually conditioned by our social circumstances. So not only are the effects themselves conditioned, but also our way of evaluating. And so please help me, all of you, in thanking Ben Anderson and Rebecca Coleman. Thank you.